Do people talk about you behind your back? Do they lie about you? Do they cause trouble for you? What should you do? Today, David is going to tell us because there's a king that's out to kill him. And it's happening because people are lying to him, lying to the king, telling him David is wanting to take the throne when in fact David isn't ready to do that. Join us today as we see how David handled this. All right, welcome to our Psalm series. Glad you're joining us today. Let's start here. Rob and I started watching this TV show called Bull. Michael Weatherly, who used to play on NCIS for a billion years, he left the show and he stars in this particular one. And it's about lawyers and it's about juries. And his job is to defend clients and find specific jurors who will help him win the case. Now, the other night we were watching an episode and it reminded me of the Psalms because there was a woman who rushed her 4-year-old stepdaughter to the hospital because she stopped breathing. Now, the cause of this little girl's death was overdose of salt, okay? Now, the stepmother is now accused of murder, and it would be Bull's job to prove that she actually didn't do it. But the problem was the biological mother and another woman that worked at a kids club that knew this stepmother. And these two would say really, really hurtful, awful things about this woman and make her sound as if she was guilty of killing this child when in fact she really didn't. The problem was that they were saying half-truths and making people think that she was responsible. The storyline reminded me a little bit about this psalm today because apparently I think human nature hasn't changed much in thousands of years. For us in today's lesson, it wasn't a stepmom on trial for murder. It was David, a man after God's own heart, the man who God said would be the next king of Israel. It was him, and he was being slandered. It was David who was being lied to, and those lies were causing King Saul to go after him and try to kill him. Now, there were a few times in David's life where this psalm could actually fit. The problem with a lot of psalms is we don't know exactly what psalm was written in what period unless it tells us, where some of them do. But one of these times is when King Saul is trying to kill him. We'll read this in 1 Samuel 23, verse 25. Saul and his men began the search, and when David was told about it, he went to the rock and stayed in the desert of Maon. Then when Saul heard this, he went into the desert of Maon in pursuit of David. Saul was going along one side of the mountain, and David and his men were on the other side, hurrying to get away from Saul. As Saul and his forces were closing in on David and his men to capture them, now think about this, you've got this big army of King Saul. They're coming against David. They're chasing him all over the desert, and they're trying to kill him. And it's really brought on by lies of people saying things that aren't true. But watch this next portion of this in verse 27. God stops it. A messenger came to Saul saying, "Come quickly, the Philistines are raiding the land." Then Saul broke off his pursuit of David and went to meet the Philistines. Now, it's so fascinating to me that God did this at the exact same time that David needs help. And it's just this reminder when we're studying the Psalms that God is so intricately involved in your life. He just is. Like we think, well, he doesn't care about that, or he doesn't care about that person who's saying bad things about me, or he doesn't care that that person's hurting me. That's not true. Always know that he's right in the midst of this with you. But once Saul leaves, David thinks he's okay for now, but Saul comes after him again. Look at 1 Samuel 24, verse 1. After Saul returned from pursuing the Philistines, he was told, "David is in the desert of En-Gedi." So Saul took 3,000 chosen men from all Israel and set out to look for David and his men near the crags of the wild goats. He came to the sheep pens along the way. A cave was there, and Saul went in to relieve himself. David and his men were far back in the cave. David sees Saul there. Saul doesn't know David's in the back of the cave. But when it's all said and done, Saul walks out, and David walks out behind and confronts him. He says, Saul, what is wrong with you? Why are you chasing me? I would never do the things that your men are telling you that I would do. But with these stories, we need to remember that David was under a ton of stress at this time. Because of people who were lying about him, David was like, that's not true. I'm not trying to do that. And some of you are in that place where maybe your coworker's talking behind your back, or maybe your spouse is saying something about you so that he can, get custody of the kids or whatever. It's this place where you're like, why are people saying bad things about me that aren't even true? So it's a time like this that David writes this psalm. Psalm number 7 is what we're on. It starts out and says this, a Shiggaion of David, which he sang to the Lord. Now the word Shiggaion is used only in this psalm, and it's thought to have meant something like a passionate psalm with strong emotion. So this just tells us that at this point in David's life, he's just pouring out his heart. There's so much emotion in what he's trying to say. And he says this concerning Cush, a Benjamite. So basically, a Shiggaion of David, which he sang to the Lord, and it's concerning Cush, who is a Benjamite. Cush was from the tribe of Benjamin, and which is the same tribe that King Saul was from. And it seemed Cush was probably saying things to Saul that he probably shouldn't have said. You can imagine, hey Saul, David's trying to take your throne. Hey Saul, I saw David. I heard David saying this. He wants you off the throne, Saul. And David wasn't saying any of those things. But Cush was in there stirring the pot, trying to get Saul riled up to go after David. But think about that. The king with an army and all of his resources were hunting David down. That had to have been terrifying. But here is the response from David in verse 1. O Lord my God, I take refuge in you. Save and deliver me from all who pursue me. His focus was not on the people that were coming after him, the people who were talking bad about him. His focus was on God alone. God, you are going to have to save me from what these people are saying. We need to remember that God is that big. There was a story of a military officer and his wife. They were aboard a ship. They were caught in a raging ocean storm. Seeing this frantic look in his wife's eyes, he tried to unsuccessfully calm her down and remove her fears. Suddenly she grasped his sleeve and she looked at him and she said, how can you be so calm? We're in the middle of this raging storm. He stepped back a few feet and he drew out his sword. Pointing it at her heart, he said, are you afraid of this? And she said, well, of course not. He said, why? She said, because it's in your hand and you love me too much to hurt me. Exactly. This is what the husband said. I am not afraid because I know the one who holds the wind and the waters in the hollow of his hand. He will surely take care of us one way or the other. It's like someone said once, when a train goes through a tunnel and it gets dark, you don't throw away the ticket and jump off. You sit still and you trust the engineer. Jason Jones says this, trust in yourself and you are doomed to disappointment. Trust in your friends and they will die and leave you. Trust in money and you may have it taken from you. Trust in reputation and some slanderous tongue may blast it. But trust in God and you are never to be confounded in time or eternity. It's kind of great to remember. We have to really grasp this. God has a number of days for us. Nothing you do or I do is going to change that. Our goal as the followers of Jesus is to live those days for Him, to trust Him to do what needs to be done. Our life is in His hands. And I always say, whenever you have something, someone's after you or there's a problem, play it all the way to the end. What's the very worst that could ever happen? Is that person going to kill you? Maybe. Okay. Well, if you know Jesus, where are you going? Heaven. I think if you play everything to the end, like we win in the end. So we shouldn't be fearful of what people say about us. because somehow we just have to recognize that God is always in control. There's 4 things to remember. One of them comes from Pastor Andrew Murray of South Africa. He was facing a really terrible crisis, and he wrote this in his journal. This needs to go on our refrigerators. I am here by God's appointment. In that fact, I will rest. I am here by God's appointment. In that, I can rest. Isn't that amazing? Like, imagine living your life like that. Like, no matter who's hurting me, what trial I'm going through, who's after me, I am in this place by God's appointment. He's going to do something with me, teach me something, grow me up, whatever it is. And see, David knew this. And that's why I think David could rest most of the time. Was it difficult? Yeah, I think it was. Was it confusing? Yeah. Did David understand what God was doing? Probably not. But he rested on the fact that whatever situation he was in was God's appointment. See, there's so much peace and comfort in that. Whatever you're going through, look at life like that. God has not forgotten you. The second thing is this: He will keep me here in His love and give me grace to behave as His child. See, no matter what we're going through, God wants us to act like His child. God wanted David to act like His child, even though Saul was after him, trying to kill him. What do children do? Well, if they have a good, loving daddy who wants to take care of them, the child trusts the dad. We can trust our Heavenly Father. The third thing we need to know is this: He will teach me the lessons He intends me to learn. Sometimes people gossiping about us or coming after us, God is trying to teach us something. So let's stop and try to learn the lesson. See, sometimes we see things like sickness and death and bad marriages and difficult kids and problems, and we see all that, and we don't understand why, but we have to remember God is doing something through it all. We have to learn to trust that. Someone wrote this once: the problem is we breathe God-ignoring air. We breathe in where I'm ignoring God. I'm not putting God in the equation. We breathe that in and it's sucking the life out of us. But we need to start doing this. We need to breathe God-focused air. We breathe in God. God, I know you're doing something about this. I'm trusting you with this. And when we can do that, we honestly don't look at our problems the way the world does. We just don't. We just look at it differently. We know God is in it. He's doing something. He's teaching me something. He wants to do something overarching that maybe I don't see at the moment. And then the fourth one is this: in His good time, He can bring me out again. That's a great reminder. In His timing, He will bring us out of whatever it is. But I'm going to say this. In this modern cultural time where we're taught this easy believism Christianity that's like, God just wants you to be happy and He wants you to be healthy and He wants you to be wealthy. He just doesn't want you to have any problems. That's not true. But when someone is taught that, then they're frightened when something bad happens in their life. Because suddenly they assume that God has forgotten them, but nothing is farther from the truth. And that's what we need to remember. Following Jesus does not mean we ask Him into our heart, we get baptized, and we're good to go. Life is just going to be great the rest of our life. It doesn't work that way. Following Jesus means now we become a disciple. Got Questions says this about a disciple. A disciple is a follower, someone who adheres completely to the teachings of another, making them his rule of life and conduct. The Pharisees prided themselves in being disciples of Moses. We're not disciples of Moses, we're disciples of Jesus. Jesus' followers were called disciples long before they were ever called Christians. Their discipleship began with Jesus' call and required them to exercise their will to follow Him. Jesus was quite explicit about the cost of following Him. Discipleship requires a totally committed life. Any of you who does not give up everything, he cannot be my disciple, Luke 14:33 says. Sacrifice is expected. Jesus said to his disciples, if anyone would come after me, he must deny himself and take up his cross and follow me. Matthew 16:24. See, I don't see anywhere where it says being a disciple is just an easy life. It's not. It's sacrificial. Not all of Jesus' followers were able to make such a commitment. There were many who left Jesus after a while. From this time, many of his disciples turned back and no longer followed him. John 6:66. For true Christians, true followers of Jesus, we've counted the cost. Our life is truly in his hands, and David understands this. He understands right from the beginning that life is not going to go as he expected it. Life is not always going to go how we think it should. But he did know this. If God doesn't step in, he would die. He says this in verse 2. Or they will tear me like a lion and rip me to pieces with no one to rescue me. David knew that the odds were stacked completely against him, and the only way that he was going to make it out alive is a miracle from God. But what David does is kind of amazing. He doesn't blame Saul or blame anyone else. He wants to be right with God first and foremost. It's funny how we always like to blame someone else, but he doesn't do that. He stops and he says, God, if I'm the problem with this, then I need to stop here and make things right with you first. Look at verse 3. O Lord my God, if I have done this and there is guilt on my hands, if I have done evil to him who is at peace with me or without cause have robbed my foe, then let my enemy pursue and overtake me. Let him trample my life to the ground and make me sleep in the dust. David sees this. He's like, God, if any of this is happening because of my sin or something I'm doing, just kill me now. See, David and his men were in the back of this cave when Saul was using the cave as his bathroom. And it's so fascinating that David could have killed Saul on the spot, but he doesn't. Look at 1 Samuel 24:4. The men said, this is the day the Lord spoke of when he said, I will give your enemy into your hands for you to deal with as you wish. The people that were around David gave him wrong counsel. They're like, go for it, David, get Saul. You deserve this. So David crept up unnoticed and cut off a corner of Saul's robe. But look what happened. They didn't all cheer. The other guys might have. David didn't. David's heart felt so sick over what he did. Verse 5, afterward, David was conscience-stricken for having cut off a corner of his robe. He said to his men, the Lord forbid that I should do such a thing to my master, the Lord's anointed, or lift my hand up against him, for he is the anointed of the Lord. David said, Saul is king. Saul is king because God made him king. And I can never come up against God's anointed person. I just cut off a portion of his robe. That's wrong. And David says this about a man who's trying to kill him. It's amazing. Verse 7, with these words, David rebuked his men and did not allow them to attack Saul. And Saul left the cave and went his way. And David went out of the cave and called out to Saul, my lord the king. He was so honoring to the king who was trying to kill him. When Saul looked behind him, David bowed down and prostrated himself with his face to the ground. He said to Saul, why do you listen when men say David is bent on harming you? Why are you listening to these false accusations, these false things that people are saying? David goes on to say in verse 10, this day you have seen with your own eyes how the Lord delivered you into my hands in the cave. Some urged me to kill you, but I spared you because I will not lift up my hand against my master because he is the Lord's anointed. David cared so much more for what God thought than what any of his men thought. So he first looked inward. He wanted to make sure he was right with God. And then verse 6 says, arise, O Lord, in your anger, rise up against the rage of my enemies. Awake, my God, decree, judge us. Judge. It would be nice if I could say that word. Decree justice. Verse 7, let the assembled People gather around you. Rule over them from on high. Let the Lord judge the peoples. Judge me, O Lord, according to my righteousness, according to my integrity, O Most High. David knew that God alone was the righteous judge. He knew that God would judge David, but he would also judge Saul, and he trusted God to judge rightly. Verse 9, O righteous God who searches minds and hearts, bring to an end the violence of the wicked and make the righteous secure. In other words, God, you know my heart. You know their heart. I can only worry about me. You take care of them. I love verse 10. He says, my shield is God Most High. My shield, who saves the upright in heart. God is a righteous judge, a God who expresses his wrath every day. I love this visual. God goes before David. He's his shield. A shield protects a soldier from the enemy's weapons. So Psalm 7 says this, if he does not turn back, in other words, if Saul and his army do not turn back and go away from David, God himself will sharpen his sword, he bends his bow, and he makes it ready. He's saying, my God will attack you because that's how much he cares about me. Verse 13, he also prepares for himself instruments of death. He makes his arrows into fiery shafts. Behold, the wicked brings forth iniquity. Yes, he conceives trouble and brings forth falsehood. He made a pit and dug it out and has fallen into the ditch which he made. His trouble shall return upon his own head, and his violent dealing shall come down on his own crown. David is reminding us that there are serious consequences for those who come up against God and his people. There are serious consequences to those people that are coming against you as a child of God. He can pull back his bow and shoot the arrow, and he can do more things to that person who's harming you than you ever could. So the takeaway for today is this. God will deal with our enemies. He will. Maybe today, maybe tomorrow, maybe not even in this lifetime at all. But there is an eternity waiting for evil people in a place called hell. And if they don't get their due on this short time that they're living on this earth, they will pay for all eternity. And David knows this. And because he knows this, he ends with these words in verse 17. I will praise the Lord according to his righteousness, and will sing praise to the name of the Lord Most High. I love how whenever David gets in trouble, his fear and his anxiety always turns back towards God. And I think the most valuable lesson I learned from this lesson today is this. No matter where I am, no matter the trials I'm going through, no matter what happens, I am here by God's appointment. In that fact, I will rest. And we just need to say, God, what do you want to do with me now? Because I need to learn what you want to teach me. Hope that helps today. Have a really good day.